So for this session, I'm thrilled to introduce the team at the Division of Research, Ventures, and Innovation, also known as DRIVe, from the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. During this session, we will hear an overview of BARDA DRIVe, the DRIVe Accelerator Network, BARDA Ventures, and DRIVe Start. And additionally, we will get what I'm sure is a very interesting and very informative panel discussion on program priorities in DRIVe and their future vision. The session will wrap with a discussion on the intersection between DRIVe funding opportunities and new program starts. If we have time at the end, we will have a short Q&A session. Those of you just joining us, please write your questions in the chat box and we will try to get to as many of them as possible.
All right, cool. All right, welcome. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Again, too bad it's a virtual event. Otherwise, we'd all be gathered in, crowded San Francisco at this time. But either way, I'm excited to be with you all. I have a few goals here. So, I introduced, so I don't have to go over myself. But I am the director of DRIVe, which is a 2-year-old or 3-year-old now program, and I've been here since last March. And I really have just a kind of a few goals here. One is just I want to get, we're not that well known yet because we're still, I would call us a startup in the government scene. So I want you to get to know who we are, what we offer. I want you guys to leave understanding sort of how we operate, and in particular, just trying to emphasize the point that we are not your typical government funder. We try to act and think differently and cater and be very business friendly in terms of how we operate and work with partners, and not just as a funder. And then, if there's alignment and interest, I want you all to come away with an excitement and a desire to seek partnerships with us, and that's really the goal is to connect dots here. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of sort of the team, what we've been doing, how we operate, all that kind of stuff, and then we'll have Justin Yang, my colleague here, talk about a different part of DRIVe, and then we'll have our leaders on all of these program areas kind of dive into current opportunities and things like that. So I want this to be discussive. So if you guys have questions along the way, shoot them in the chat. We'll try to get to them into the panel and the Q&A later on. But it's really helpful to know like what you want to hear exactly from us. We're going to be here for 2 hours, so otherwise sit back, relax, enjoy, yeah. So BARDA. So if you guys don't know BARDA, we're the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. We are a team within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. government, within the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. So our colleagues at NIH, who are also at the session today, are also part of HHS in a different part. And our goal primarily, if you're not familiar, is to develop medical countermeasures. And this can include medical countermeasures to vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, things like that, in response to an emergency like a nuclear attack, chemical exposure, to a pandemic, or to a variety of other kinds of events. And what characterizes BARDA in its 14-year-old history really is that we operate through partnerships. We partner with large and small organizations to really rapidly advance these products in a way that they can be effectively developed and deployed as used. And we have with us a lot of innovative mechanisms within government to act in a way that typically government doesn't often act, and be flexible and promote innovation and things like that. The way BARDA is organized is, and this kind of goes to sort of how we're funded generally, is we, one focus area is around, pandemic influenza, emerging infectious diseases. Another focus area is around developing countermeasures to chemical, radiological, nuclear threats. We have a device detection kind of team, and we have a manufacturing team. And then 2 years ago, this is the newest division, and the one you're going to hear about today, called DRIVe, was really set up in part to recognize that the landscape in health and health security in life sciences is vastly different now than it used to be. And looking forward, it's going to continue to be different. Things like, we're seeing advances in adjacent spaces, outside of life sciences that impact life sciences themselves, whether it's, AI, computational, sensor development, there's all of these areas that are impacting. And we really need to stay on top of everything, support the kinds of technologies and approaches and capabilities that will ultimately improve our health security posture over time and allow us to be more nimble and create that pipeline later on. And so that in part was the reason we set up DRIVe. Another aspect of this that I want to mention is that, the typical way we've been attacking things like, or responding to things like outbreaks, pathogen attacks, stuff like that is, looking at it threat by threat. And there's sort of this modality change that's happening, and DRIVe is helping in this change, which is how do we develop capabilities such that we're better prepared for any situation, that we invest in platform technologies and approaches that no matter the threat can be ultimately impactful. And so that's sort of another thread of how we operate. So there's a few different things. You'll get a flavor of this as you hear from the group, but we're a funder, and one thing we're trying to do is, we've developed these program specific kind of approaches to that larger problem, and we're making early stage investments in those spaces. Another piece of this is we're trying to really innovate what it is to be a government funder in many ways, and so we have a whole effort around partnerships with health accelerators to try to support early stage companies that might have a really high impact product or idea, but otherwise might need some help being successful, and that we through our accelerators can provide some of those services. Things like improving our process of submission for funding and the way we interact on that front. And then, even just developing completely new finance models that are high impact, which you'll hear about later. So the one way to sort of think about this in terms of opportunities for innovation, and this is sort of our sort of 30,000 foot level, like how do we, where are opportunities where we should focus on, right? Is if you think about this sort of continuum of a response, and let's just use an outbreak, a pandemic as an example here. The first thing that as it emerges, right, the first capability that's super key, and this year has really made this, or last year has made this really apparent, is, identifying the nature of this threat, containing it, being aware, and surveillance, on a number of different levels is really key, and can really be a game changer in a lot of circumstances. So how do we do better on that front, right? How do we characterize and identify the threat generally before it becomes, a epidemic, pandemic level kind of thing? How do we improve the way we even design countermeasures? And, not just thinking about traditional ways of vaccines and drugs, which are obviously effective or can be effective, but, thinking about, other types of interventions that could also be effective or enhance the efficacy of the other things, right? How do we improve the whole validation process, right? The mRNA vaccine development this year has just been, a game changer, but, it's also going to now create opportunities to say, well, how do we even improve the trial process to speed up the vaccine development validation, even further than we did last year? Improving manufacturing and think about on-demand, forward deployed manufacturing, which is becoming increasingly possible with some of the other life science technologies. How do we improve the way we distribute these items and ultimately deliver the things that need to be delivered to people, right? So this goes back to the vaccines don't save lives, but vaccinations save lives kinds of issue things. So this is sort of the broad range of issues that we're looking at, and we've developed over the last 2 years a core set of programs that are focused on aspects of this. And so I'll give you a flavor of ENACT and solving sepsis, beyond the needle, and redirect. The latter two we started this year. My colleague Justin Yang is going to give you a sense of the DRIVe Catalyst Office, which is really looking at the intersection of science and business. And before I get into that, I just wanted to give you a highlight. You'll hear about this later, but just to tease this, one of the things that underpins how we operate is this funding vehicle that we've created. We borrowed from DARPA, but we spun it into our own uses that we call the EZ-BAA. And the idea here is that we want to be really fast and approachable and catering to needs of startups and especially those where time is of essence in terms of survival. and trying to create a process that just makes sense. So we've created this vehicle that is designed to be fast, easy to use, flexible, all that kind of stuff. Low dollar amount. So this is a $750,000 or less vehicle with a cost share requirement. But we can turn this around, from a solicitation to an award, in some cases, within days, and, allows us to be nimble and responsive to needs as well. So you'll hear more about that later. All right, ENACT. So this is sort of program number one. We started, DRIVe was really created, I think, with two pillar programs that continue to be part of our operations. One is ENACT, which is really focused on this idea of how do we improve the ability of technology to detect disease states much earlier than we typically can, and in a way that enables actionable responses, either by the patient, by healthcare providers, or other stakeholders. And which obviously this year or last year has become an extremely important issue, and one that has just surfaced as something that is really important in addressing pandemics. And so one aspect of this is, we're looking at, can we, for example, pre-symptomatically detect infectious disease states like flu, like COVID-19, things like that. The other piece is, can we design systems such that information is efficiently channeled to the key decision makers so that, we can do, diagnosis earlier, but also treat earlier as well. And then, how do we connect this with public health systems where compiling information like this can enable allocation of resources and quick action on a population level as well. And we've made several investments in this space for the last few years, mostly focused on the pre-symptomatic aspect, the sensor development piece of this. But we're also looking at areas around controlling and treating as well. You'll hear more about this from Shayla, who's running this program later on. We have an area of interest open, just to tease this out. So, we're looking at things like, developing novel sensors, particularly ones that are minimally invasive, looking at improved ways to detect, host-based markers to detect disease states and differentiate disease states. AI solutions that can triage and create insights from data efficiently into the right people. And this is something that I want to highlight too, is that we're also looking at, how do we design these such that it's useful for diverse populations? And this is a really important point that spans across everything we do. I think we're not necessarily looking to design for specific populations only. We want this to be broadly applicable because in an emergency situation, everybody's affected, and we need to ensure the tools that we have help everybody along the way. So the second program that you'll hear about is solving sepsis. So sepsis, if you guys don't know, is a secondary condition in the body where there's sort of a dysregulation in the immune system. And this is a common outcome of many forms of infection, viral, bacterial, but also trauma and injury. And it's a common theme that we see that, as soon as we treat the initial pathogen or factor, that, the body can still react adversely, and that we need to address those properly. And, COVID-19 is no exception, because we found that severe COVID-19 is in fact, sepsis in many ways. And so, in addition to treating the pathogen, we need to think about how do we restore that kind of function. And more importantly, as importantly, differentiate, based on some host factors, whether someone's likely to develop severe forms of a disease or mild forms of disease. We can really impact hospitals' ability to triage. And this is not just an emergency situation. So sepsis is a national crisis. There's over 1 million people each year in the U.S. that are affected. About 270,000 Americans die each year as a result of sepsis. There's a huge economic impact, $60 million estimated. And this is really an opportunity for us to think about this in a more systemic way. And this is how we're approaching this. You'll hear more about this from our program manager, Kim, around this. But one thing that's important is that there are several opportunities in this sort of continuum to intervene. So one thing that we're initially focused on is how do we predict sepsis? How do we detect sepsis, whether it's in a hospital setting or even in the community where we see most cases actually arise? So, interestingly enough, nearly half the septic cases that we see happen within 7 days after a clinician has seen a patient. And so we're missing these opportunities to catch sepsis, after somebody is discharged from a hospital or a clinic. So we're looking at ways to develop these that affect that. We made several investments in this space, some on the awareness piece, where we partnered with some groups to create broader awareness. There's a healthcare cultural issue here that we're trying to address in terms of prior assumptions of what sepsis is, that we're trying to help dispel. And we've been focused, like I said, on this prediction piece, using both machine learning aspects, but developing newer sort of biomarker-based panels and tools and blood-based detection tools as well. Another program that we launched this year, led by Carrie DeMarco here, is what we call Beyond the Needle. And a lot of this was, we had sort of thought through this before COVID, but it became even more apparent during COVID, which is that, looking forward, we really need to think about how do we improve the way we actually can deliver vaccines to people, and not just vaccines, but other kinds of therapeutics, and really getting out of this dependence on syringes and needles. So what is it, like around 20% of the US population is afraid of syringes and needles. There's obviously supply chain issues, especially cold chain requirements with things like vaccines. The compliance issues, like I mentioned, and then other sort of resource constraints around ancillary supplies and things like that. And so there's a really key opportunity, I think, to vastly improve the way we can deliver these kinds of drugs and vaccines to people efficiently in the future. Things like microneedle skin patches, inhalable forms of drugs and vaccines and things like that. And then even more importantly to that, can we use these alternative forms of delivering to actually improve therapeutic efficacy? In certain cases with vaccines, we see that's quite possible. And so we're really focused on getting beyond the syringe and needle modality here. Yeah, I mentioned this, so I'll skip over this, but we've already made several investments in this space, focused on COVID-19 mostly, and we're looking for other transformative approaches, not only, like I said, for that, but things like small molecule therapeutics and other forms as well. We're really looking for innovative, user-friendly approaches to this space. So if you guys are have thoughts on this or are working on this, we'd really love to hear from you on that. Another group, solicitation or program that we launched this year is around this idea of chemical exposure. So this is one of our core areas. The problem with this space is that, first of all, chemical exposures can happen in a lot of different circumstances, right? Day to day in your home, mass events from manufacturing plants, intentional threats and attacks. And this is a scenario where minutes really matter, right? Time is of the essence. People need to be treated as fast as possible in those scenarios. And traditionally, we relied on the stockpile model here. So, developing products that we would then stockpile and use in the case of emergency. And I think in this case, that model really breaks down, and we really need to think about, how do we tie this better with commercial markets, and in particular, looking at approaches that are easily available within communities, within hospitals, things like that. So the idea of this program is really that, right? Accessible, effective drugs that are available. Repurposing is really the approach that we think makes a lot of sense. Is repurpose existing drugs or drugs that are past safety profiles that we can test for an indication that matters in this circumstance, such that if an event happens, somebody shows up in an ED, that therapeutic might be readily available anyway in that hospital, right? And so we're looking for proof of concept studies. You'll hear more about this later as well. And this is in partnership with our chemical branch at BARDA as well. In our short 2 years, we've developed a fairly robust portfolio across some of these programs. This just gives you a sense of, our partners. And in terms of COVID-19, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on this. Last year we did a huge pivot in our entire program to address and respond to COVID-19. And we continue to do that up to this day through our programs. And both ENACT and Solving Sepsis, as I alluded to before, are issues that are directly relevant to COVID-19, right? So detecting potential suspected COVID-19 in people asymptomatically, pre-symptomatically in their home. If somebody doesn't have access to a PCR test, how can someone get a sense of whether they might have COVID-19? And so we pivoted many of our programs through our partnerships to directly address these questions. Also looking at Solving Sepsis, which is really, like I said, focused in part on this infection severity sort of aspect. And hospitals right now are just inundated with patients across the country, and with very little ability to triage, those patients that are going to have mild symptoms versus severe symptoms. And so, can we deliver tools to them that such that they can quickly, predict these things, these outcomes, and appropriately triage with limited resources. So we've had a variety of partnerships, from telehealth approaches, surveillance-based approaches to getting nowcasting for disease, to a 10-minute blood test for predicting sepsis, right? So there's a wide variety of things in here that we've invested in. The other piece of this too, just so what we're potentially capable of here, is with our partners in the diagnostics division last February and March, really. We partnered with them to launch the BARDA COVID diagnostics program, and so we made some rapid investments in PCR, point of care, antigen-based diagnostics, which then were followed up with larger awards to really rapidly commercialize and get these tests to people as fast as possible early in the pandemic, which proved quite important. Obviously, this is an ongoing need across the board, but we were able to leverage our rapid contracting mechanism for this purpose as well, and built this, as well as many of the other sort of COVID-specific pieces as well. So this is our team. We have a large and diverse and awesome team. Again, this is not your typical government group where we have former stockbrokers, we have venture capitalists on our team, we have ex-DARPA, ex-NIH, ex-industry, also across the board. We bring a lot to the table. And so I'm just really lucky to be where I am with this team. And you're going to hear from our leaders later on that front. Again, if you guys have questions, check out our website, drive.hs.gov. Has a lot of the info that I mentioned. You can email me. You can email our contracting staff if you have questions on sort of how to work with us. If you want to check out the broader BARDA portfolio, go to medicalcountermeasures.gov. And you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and other places as well. So thank you all. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Justin, who's going to run over the Catalyst office and the business side of our work as well.
So thanks, Sandeep, for your introduction. And as Sandeep mentioned, Sandeep is the DRIVe director. I'm the director of the DRIVe Catalyst office here. And what is the Catalyst office? So the Catalyst office really is the intersection between science and business, how we see it here. I mean, over the last number of years, decade here at BARDA, we've really focused on getting products approved and getting products to market, right? So over 50 FDA approvals, clearances, licensures. Our FreeMind colleagues and hosts here have had previous BARDA directors and also directors on previous FreeMind conferences. And we've, laid out like basically what we've done well. And what we've done well is essentially we have, been able to support an unmet need and bring products to market, at a speed of which faster and help to save lives, right? However, oftentimes in the past, we haven't thought about, which is, are we bringing products to the marketplace to fail, because there are certain market conditions in which an approval may not be enough, right? We have other problems and hurdles that need to be met, and this is kind of an area that I've been dedicating my tenure here at BARDA around, is the idea of how can we both address unmet needs, but also you know develop new economic or new financing models that can help provide more than just a check, which is good, but not the end all be all. Money is out there for technologies, and you guys all here, entrepreneurs and executives and startups, can attest to how hard it is to get money, but also how hard it is to just move your product or technology further, just a sliver. So we've built this, three cornerstone kind of programs here in the Catalyst office, and everything you heard about before me and everything you hear about after me will be very clearly non-dilutive in nature. And we do also here in my office look at non-dilutive financing and funding, but also we are looking at exploring other financing models. So we have the Accelerator Network, we have the BARDA Ventures program, and we have the Drive Start program, and I'm going to go into each of those and take questions. If you have chat and questions, put them in. And I can't see them, but I will see them afterwards, and I definitely respond to you guys. But the name is of itself. We want to make an increase in rate of a chemical reaction, and without undergoing a permanent change. We want to get above the hill faster, and using a catalyst method to do so. So what are we doing here? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm sure all of you guys are well aware of this kind of valley of death and this pyramid that essentially is before you. It's we start from the basic translational research side, where our colleagues at NIH and DARPA have done a great job in providing billions and billions of dollars into the ecosystem, and arguably everything that we see today for COVID-19 has stemmed from both our NIH, NIAID colleagues and our DARPA colleagues' investments. The Moderna vaccine. The Moderna vaccine started genesis from a DARPA seedling grant contract vehicle to early on, and then followed it up with additional funding for a chikungunya vaccine for Moderna, right? And then they pivoted to Zika in 2016, where BARDA had picked them up for additional funding support to develop a candidate vaccine using the mRNA platform. Fast forward to 2020, we saw the need and the NIAID, generation of the sequence for the Moderna vaccine with our support with our colleagues at the NIH. So the key critical component of this is that the basic translational research lays the groundwork for responding to pandemics. We move a little bit up above that level. We get into the DITRA and JPEO, our DITRA JPEO, or even sometimes our NCATS colleagues, where we're developing advanced development and clinical trials, which is a little bit different. This is typically a post tox, IND enabling kind of efforts, where you're now going into a phase 1, phase 2 clinical evaluation, right? So moving above that and moving down the path, and each of these steps are littered with failed molecules, failed technologies, and it's just the valley of death, if you will. There's two valley of deaths really in product development that I see. Is that the first valley of death is really here between the awesome Nature report paper that you guys get out to starting a phase 1 trial, and then there's a valley of death later, where you have the safety profiles well thought out, but you just won't get follow-on funding for a later stage clinical trial, which involves 30,000 people, and costs $1 billion, right? So what I've done in my office is we've tried to build out a one-stop shop. And I'm hesitant to say the word bank because we're not a bank, but really we're developing an investment model that can help address unmet needs such as COVID-19, pandemics, and health security. You start here from the BARDA on the right-hand side, from the BARDA EZ-BAA broad agency announcement that is non-dilutive in nature. That's $749,000. That doesn't require a huge hurdle to apply, or you can take quote unquote a BARDA Ventures equity financing round and move your technology up this scale, right? So we've intentionally started to secure partnerships around this, where now we have a partnership with our colleagues at the Development Finance Corporation, the EFC, which is another government agency that provides debt-based financing structures, which spun out of the USAID slash formerly known as OPIC, right? If people who know the government. So under COVID-19, our DFC colleagues received, I'm going to say a lot of acronyms, I apologize, it's the way of the government, but DFC received what's known as the Defense Production Act Authority, of which they can now provide loan or debt financing vehicle to product developers in the United States, whereas historically they were not able to do that because they focus on an international financing and giving model. And then, of course, moving up the chain here, we have Project BioShield, the Strategic National Stockpile, and DFC as well. The Project BioShield is a market commitment mechanism that was signed under the Bush administration that has continued, which states that if you bring a product that is of U.S. government concern that we greatly care about, we would be able to provide purchase agreements or stockpile agreements such that you can keep, you're developing maybe an anthrax vaccine or smallpox vaccine or some therapeutic which has no marketability, we would pay to stockpile that. So essentially one-stop shop from early research all the way to late stage post-market. We're providing a one-stop shop of financing for entrepreneurs, and through some of these relationships that we have built out of my office. And as we all know, as we move to the next stage, the number of candidates greatly decrease, the funding required greatly increases, and the level of funding from available funding chains, such as government agencies, also decreases. So it's just, it's a problem that we're trying to solve here that I think about every day. So talking a little bit about the DRIVe Accelerator Network. So the DRIVe Accelerator Network is a network of 13 accelerators across the country in the United States now that we have partnered with to provide these 4 pillars: technology sourcing, wraparound support, market research and outreach, events and networking. So I'm going to go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So as you can see, we've in the first year, we had partnered with accelerators across the coasts and the southern borders of the United States. And whether that's by intention or not, it's just, that's where innovation was occurring, that we're seeing. But we know that even the people on the phone today or on the Zoom today is that, innovation is occurring all across the United States and all across the world. And that there's people who are doing great work in the Midwest or in the southern areas of the United States that may not have access to wraparound support. So the accelerators really, as a function, is both a push and a pull mechanism where they serve a purpose in that community or in that region or in that targeted area where they can provide you services. So today, for example, any one of you guys, if you guys are located in the Bay Area, you can reach out to a group like Plug and Play to talk about, your digital health application or some, diagnostic that you have or any other kind of technologies that you may have. And, you can call them up and say, hey, we're interested in helping to understand how do we incorporate or how do we who do you know that is a regulatory consultant in this area, right? And Plug and Play will say, all right, here's our list. You can have a free, 1 hour consult with our individual, and that's a service that's provided to you guys. Also, many of these accelerators across the country have both virtual and also some have live fellowship cohorts where you could have free access to wet and dry lab space. You could have access to mentors, and you could have access to potential investors, right? So, and there's also conferences and whatnot that they host on behalf of BARDA, as well as on behalf of the U.S. government, as well as on behalf of their region. So it's a no strings attached model. You can go there. They're, the mandate is like they're not to take, equity. They're not to. It's basically to help you guys out, and this service is there. And we have the list on our website. But following this meeting, feel free to reach out to me, and I can get you in touch with any number of these accelerators. And just so you know, some of these accelerators have different offerings that may be relevant to your technology. Some are really good on therapeutics and drug development. Some are really good at medical devices. Some are really good at digital. So it just depends on what you're looking for, and we are happy to facilitate any conversations. No strings attached there, just for the community. So I'm going to move on to the second cornerstone of the program, which is BARDA Ventures. And just to talk a little bit about it, we haven't made any announcements in terms of who we've selected as the venture capital entity. We haven't made any announcements on the kind of we haven't taken any investments yet, but stay tuned. I think in the next really shortly this year, we'll be able to start making investments. So what is BARDA Ventures, right? So the initiative really was stemmed from a 2010 report that talked about how there was a market, gap in terms of government financing or government contracts and the flexibility around that, and really to support and develop an ecosystem in infectious disease and other spaces. BARDA, they suggested that BARDA establish what's known as a strategic investor, right, as a recommendation in 2010. Fast forward 2016, 6 years later, from that recommendation, Congress put in place authority, or Congress passed a law that was signed by the Obama administration that was the 21st Century Cures Act. And in the 21st Century Cures Act, of course, it was a landmark piece of legislation that took years to develop, right? And lots of agencies got authorities and mandates to do certain things that improve health outcomes for the American people, of which BARDA received the authority to do this, right? Which is utilize venture capital practices and to make investments, to rejuvenate the marketplace by proving investments can be impactful in health security, net a positive return, and promoting and cementing U.S. government as a player in the life sciences field. Now, this is important because, as we all know, prior to the pandemic, right, in the last 5 years, I would say, is that no one really in the United States in the venture community thought infectious diseases such as antimicrobials or anti-infectives were positive enough to generate a positive outcome. No pharmaceutical player, other than viewing this as a corporate social responsibility, was developing clinical assets around infectious disease, especially emerging infectious disease. And with that, problem what became problematic is that now we're seeing the impact of the pandemic and how much it truly costs in societal costs as well as true dollar costs, the impact of a global pandemic, right? I mean, just think about, if we know what we knew today back in March or February, what things we would have done differently, or even 5 years ago, if we knew 2020 would be a global pandemic that basically shut down entire economies and the world, what we would do differently. So, I put this slide up here. The slide is actually getting older now, but COVID-19 has showed us this immediate opportunity to spur investments. Now we're seeing life science venture capitalists committed $5 billion, and this figure is probably from April, so it's probably a lot larger in terms of kind of raising specific funds around pandemics. And this is something that we've been talking about. If you go to recordings that I've done even 4 years ago or 3 years ago when I first joined BARDA, I talked about how a novel avian influenza that's highly pathogenic, highly transmissible could cause this, right? Even coronaviruses that we've seen, SARS-1, MERS, and some other coronaviruses that we knew that this was coming. And unfortunately, we didn't have the foresight to, or we weren't prepared enough to quickly move in this field. And this is what we're trying to do here today: is prevent the next pandemic from occurring through investments. So why BARDA Ventures? We know 21st century threats are complex and unpredictable. We know that we need better tools to prepare and respond, but we know that the speed at which response occurs is not fast enough, unfortunately. BARDA Ventures would enable BARDA and the US government to act with the speed and flexibility to complement traditional approaches such as the broad agency announcement or grants that the NIH provides. We would fortify BARDA and USG as an influence on health security development, rejuvenating this ecosystem, crowding in resources and private dollars. And we would maximize taxpayer value by recycling funds from successful ventures into new investments. So these were some ideas that we've had. Again, these are all. I'm not where I want to very clearly define that the United States government, BARDA, HHS, we have a mechanism in which COVID-19 technologies are vetted, and it's not through me, right? So I don't write checks on behalf of Operation Warp Speed. So that's we have a very specific response task force for COVID-19 that's looking at vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And what we're looking at today here in DRIVe is looking at enabling technologies, platform technologies, and technologies that focus on last mile. Those are very important as well. I mean, we think about these three major buckets of a response, but we see that there's gaps in each of the steps. And we can just go from whether the clinical endpoints we're measuring or the way that we're collecting biomarkers to reach clinical endpoints is even sufficient to monitor whether it's a T cell, B cell response, right? Those are things that we've had questions about. Those are things that slow down development of vaccines, and those are things that slow down the approval process, which is very important that we get to the bottom of. From the therapeutic drug side, the repurposing of remdesivir as a COVID-19 program, really, right? I mean, it wasn't a COVID-19 therapeutic, right? It was a drug that was used for previous responses, and it was just shelved. And when COVID-19 hit, they ran it through the system and saw that there were some anti-COVID activity effects, and that spurred the development of remdesivir, right? So things like AI-enabled drug discovery or repurposing are things that we've talked about, and things that we care about. Smarter clinical trials. Can we get to a personalized clinical trial approach to target known people that are at risk to get to a placebo or get to a incidence rate that will help get to a unblinding faster of a phase 3 trial, right? So, we know that the way that, that the COVID-19 vaccine trials were structured was such that they would meet a certain number of positives, then they would unblind and see what the efficacy value was. So can we target, people who are greater risk for COVID-19 using algorithms and AI and those types of things to see if we can get to that number faster, which would save, months of time in clinical trial development and costs. Those are things that we're all thinking about. I won't go into all these points, but you can see that here. I'm happy to talk to anyone about any of these if you just want to reach out to me. So the last kind of program that we have around Catalyst is looking at Drive, what we call Drive Start. There's a bunch of car puns here, so I apologize to my car fanatics, but we like to do driving puns. So Drive Start is looking at the development and alliance management activities around building new programs, building new ideas, looking and staying up to date on the newest things that are happening in science, because we know that here in DC, the world is passing us by every day. That there's signals, there's new literature that's being published every day, and we can't stay up on that, as much. So we're engaging the community. We're developing and fostering collaborations across the interagency, and we're expanding these partnerships with new agreements and with other agencies as well. We're also providing a function in which we can provide demo and pitch days, social media outreach, and conferences and discussion panels such as this one today. And the new opportunity areas is we invite distinguished speakers to come and talk about their research challenges they have. And if you guys have some idea you want to pitch to come talk to us, feel free to reach out to Carrie DeMarco, who's on the and Rakia Spey, who's on this meeting today, and talk to them. They work on the team, and they're critical components of my team. We also have a challenge competition model, such as if you go on our website today, we're looking at reinventing the next commercial civilian face mask, right? We know that the N95 is good, but we know that the N95 may not be available or necessary for the average population. So what is that more comfortable, more protective, more readily able to be used face mask of tomorrow, respirator of tomorrow? That's something that we're thinking about today. So things that please feel free to reach out if you have any of that. All right, so here we have the how we will help. We're closing the gap between business and science. We bring both industry partners and government partners to the table. A little bit about myself: a former stockbroker, worked 6 years Department of Defense on HIV vaccines. Worked in industry for pharma. Most of my team are from industry or former venture capitalists. So we know how to, so one thing that you will see that's different from us, when you talk to other government agencies, is that we're company people, we're entrepreneurs, and we know how to really, build just like yourselves, like what the challenges are, right? Because it's easy for us for government to stand here as some sort of gray entity that's unapproachable. But my team, I can guarantee you, will be available for each and every one of you guys if you have a question. I've mandated that. So whatever you guys want to talk about, we're happy to chat with you guys about and about your technology and what we're seeing. So just FYI there, I try to make a pride of doing that. Anyone who wants to message me on LinkedIn or Twitter, it might be delayed, but because there's a lot, but I will always respond to everyone. equity, or email me or call me. Equity investments. So how we will help equity investments pre and post EZ-BAA. So if you get a BARDA contract, we could theoretically stack on some equity financing. We could incubate and launch new programs through Drive Start. We're amplifying and catalyzing investments through the accelerator network. So regardless if you have BARDA funding or not, regardless if you work with the US government or not, you can use the accelerator network. We're developing market intelligence reports and landscape reviews, and we're leading efforts in scaling, transitioning, and advancement of DRIVe candidates and products that you see. So go back to this slide here, and I'm about done here, but basically what we're doing, we're building an end-to-end shop for entrepreneurs and developers. That it's a commitment to you guys that if you have a candidate or technology that's really can solve the next pandemic or improve the US government's health security posture in the future. I mean, we're committing here to build out this ability to do financing, whether it's non-dilutive or dilutive in nature, to get you to the top of the summit. Bridge that valley of death. So here's my team here. Some of them are ancillary to my team, but we really, I have to reiterate, like, you know, I am but one small component that's probably like the dumbest person in this team of really renowned experts, and I couldn't do this without the team. Great chats, by the way. I can't. I'm gonna try to read them as I go. And if there's, so now we're approaching the open mic session, or not open mic, but the panel session with some of my colleagues here that are program officers, that are program directors of their respective areas. They're going to talk a little bit about what they do, what their areas are, what their interests are. And then if you guys just throw stuff into the chat, if you have specific questions, I will ask them during the panel. And I have some questions here. So I'm just going to dive right in. I just want everybody to go ahead and I'll butcher it if I were to say it. So everybody introduce, starting with Shayla, Kim, Carrie, Kumiko. If you guys can just introduce yourselves, what your roles are, how long you've been at BARDA, and your background, please. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Justin, for the introduction. Thanks, Sandeep, for the thorough introduction of all of the programs earlier. I'm Dr. Shayla Stalinovich. I've been at BARDA about a year now, and I manage the ENACT program. And I'm a physicist by training with follow-on training in bioengineering. So in some way, I have a very broad interest from sensors to tissue engineering. So if there's any interest in those areas here among the audience, please feel free to reach out. But for the purposes of today's panel, I'm basically a sensors person, and as I mentioned, I'm lead ENACT.
Okay, I'll go next. Hi, I'm Kim Sharetta, and thanks, Justin, for the earlier introduction. So I lead the Solving Sepsis program within BARDA DRIVe, and I'm also leading a response team for COVID-19 called Rapidly Deployable Capabilities that we can talk about a little bit later. I've been at BARDA since 2000. Previously, I was working in the CVRN division supporting antiviral, antitoxin, and antibacterial programs. But when DRIVe was launched in 2018, I came to be part of that inaugural team and have been leading the Solving Sepsis program since then. My background and training is really in molecular biology and biochemistry, but for most of my career, I've been supporting the government as a consultant before I switched over to the federal side on medical countermeasure programs, chem biodefense, some innovative areas like advanced manufacturing and synthetic biology. So thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Carrie DeMarco. I have been supporting BARDA for a couple years now, longer than that if you consider my last job. I ran a Center for Innovation in Advanced Developing and Manufacturing at Texas A&M, where I supported BARDA on the flip side, but now I am a federal employee at BARDA and running the Beyond the Needle program, as well as doing some other activities with the team. And prior to that, I have about 15 years DoD experience. A lot of my experience, even though I have a psychophysiology degree, is working really in this early, innovative, and novel space. So I really enjoy learning and helping push some of these early technologies to transition and then hopefully out to either previously DoD and now civilian and or DoD capabilities. And that's it. Thanks.
All right, and I'll go next. Hi, my name is Kamika Lippold. I am the lead for the DRIVE Redirect program that we've launched in partnership with our partners in the Chemical Medical Countermeasures branch and the CBRN division of BARDA. I am an opioid pharmacologist by training, so bench scientist for many years before transitioning over to government. And I've been supporting the government for about 2 years previously as a contractor, and did a lot of work with chronic disease and kidney disease and things before transitioning over to BARDA as a federal employee. So I currently now lead the Redirect program, and am looking forward to learning more about any of your efforts and how we can help partner and support. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So before you guys hang, so Kumiko, I want you to go now, is that if you, Sandeep gave an overview of each of your respective programs earlier on, but kind of breezed through them. If you can just like say a few sentences about about your program and the impact that you hope to achieve, and like technologies that you guys are looking for, that'd be great. And by the way, someone just messaged me and says all women panel. I just want to say, you know, these are my colleagues. They're superstar, rock star scientists first and foremost, and they make DRIVE run. So go ahead, Kumiko.
Okay, yep. So hi again. So yes, the Redirect program. It's a relatively new program that we launched back on October 1st of 2020. And the goal of this program is to basically help support the development of medical countermeasures against chemical agents. So things like chlorine gas or sulfur mustard or nerve agents or opioid exposures. Because as Sandeep mentioned earlier, during chemical emergencies, we really only have minutes to be able to respond and save lives. We don't have hours or days. We need to be able to respond in an instant to be able to save lives. So the goal of the Redirect program is to essentially provide proof of concept funding for early stage therapeutics. So ideally things that are either one, already FDA approved, or two, in late stage phase 2 or 3 clinical trials, and provide proof of concept funding so that they can essentially meet the requirements set forth in the animal rule and apply for a label expansion so that they can be used as a medical countermeasure against their primary chemical agent indication. So the whole goal of this, again, just to take a step back and make it bigger picture, is that with these commonly available therapeutics, if there's a chlorine gas exposure due to a manufacturing incident or something of that nature, we can run to the nearest pharmacy, we can take those drugs and we can give them to people during a mass casualty event and respond immediately so that additional supportive help can be on the way. So it's essentially buying us time by treating the injury rather than the actual chemical agent itself. So there's a few different focus areas that we have with this program. Our biggest priorities focus on chlorine gas, like I said, sulfur mustard, and opioids. So we're not looking at things like typical opioid antagonists. We're looking for really novel approaches to stimulate, essentially reverse respiratory depression. So those are our primary interests. And then we also have interest in trying to identify new therapeutics through some sort of AI or computational approach. So new candidates for repurposing that we can follow up with and help support for additional development. So that's really the goal of the Redirect program. We need to be able to respond in an instant. We don't have a lot of time. We need to overcome those logistical challenges that we have with stockpiling. And we think that drug repurposing is our best approach for this issue at the time. So yeah, feel free to message if you have any questions about it. I'm happy to help answer. So thank you.
All right, Carrie.
All right, so Beyond the Needle is also fairly new. It came out several months ago, but was run by someone who just retired. So I think everyone can have a general concept of what Beyond the Needle does and its purpose. Now that we're in the middle of this pandemic, we can see that there are issues with supplies, issues with cold chain. These are the type of issues we're trying to address in Beyond the Needle, as well as getting to the concerns of individuals that do have issues getting injections via needle. Like Sandeep mentioned earlier, about 20% of the population is really uncomfortable with needles. So our larger issues, of course, are really moving beyond the needle injection, breaking that needle and syringe paradigm, and being able to think beyond that. So what can we do that is easier, that doesn't need cold chain requirements, that's maybe shelf stable, things that are like micro needles, patches, oral dosage, maybe sublingual. So we're moving really into those other spaces and eventually moving towards eliminating the need for the needle. Then, yes, did you say something, Justin?
No, I thought you were done. Keep going.
Okay, so really that's where we're trying to go, and inhalation is also an option. And I think that there's a lot of great potential out there, and we're really excited because we currently have 6 programs running and we want to get more. So please check out our DRIVe website and our solicitation requirements. But right now, I think for us, we're really excited that we have been able to get funding to really move this down the road and eventually get rid of these requirements for needles, make things more stable, available, and get rid of those ancillary requirements. And, you know, just next pandemic, hopefully we'll have things more available.
Great. Kim?
Hi, thank you. So the Solving Sepsis program was introduced by Sandeep Patel earlier, but our overarching goals of the program really is to reduce the incidence, morbidity, mortality, and the economic burden of sepsis in our country. But we just don't think about research and development and product development in the program. We think about all aspects in regards to taking into consideration patient and stakeholder perspective, as well as how do we ensure that the products that we develop can get to the users and make a difference. So we think about regulatory path and other aspects that are needed for adoption in various clinical settings. So thus far, we focus mainly on infection severity diagnostics, and these are diagnostics that can identify, predict, or prognosticate the status of an infection in a patient, as well as the risk of these severe outcomes, such as sepsis. And these diagnostics to date have been focused on host-based biomarkers. So this can be blood-based biomarkers or clinical data that's collected or vital sign data. And many of these are driven by machine learning and AI approaches. But we really want to move towards an ability to stratify patients for care, such that you can tie that risk-based approach to a clinical management approach and really improve that patient care. We've also been invested or interested in host-based therapeutics and novel clinical management approaches. And this is part of our current solicitation topic, but we haven't made investments in those specifically to date. And with sepsis, it's really important to consider the fact that there's broad variability in how sepsis presents in terms of the age of the patient. So whether you're a neonate, a pediatric, or an adult or a senior, you have to consider that sepsis is prevalent in all of these populations. The clinical setting, as you may have seen from that patient continuum slide that Sandeep presented earlier, the majority of cases arise in the pre-hospital space, so in the community, not in the hospital, which is sometimes misunderstood. So having diagnostics and tools that can be readily available in outpatient settings, in nursing homes, with primary care physicians are critical in order to identify these risks of severe outcomes earlier. So we think about all these clinical settings, not just the ICU for deployment of these tools, but these preclinical settings, the hospital settings, and then also because there is such a high risk of readmission and even mortality in patients that recover from sepsis, we want to make sure that we have tools to monitor these patients once they're discharged from the hospital. I also mentioned earlier that I've been leading a team called Rapidly Deployable Capabilities for COVID-19. And this is really, it was an ability for us to leverage some of the capabilities that we had already invested in within DRIVe, really taking this pathogen agnostic approach. And when we thought of this as adjunctive technology. So the critical response obviously is having the vaccines available and the diagnostic tests available and the therapeutics available. But is there an ability to also leverage some of these technologies that look at the host response along this patient continuum and be able to pilot or clinical validate them in order to get this care to the patient sooner and monitor the status of the patient sooner? So we were really focused on 3 areas in that program. One was, and we still are, one is empowering the patients. So can you bring access to the patients either through telemedicine or remote monitors that inform on the status of a patient's infection? And Shayla's ENACT program really was leveraged for that, and she can speak more to that piece. The second was empower the provider. So can you use remote monitors and monitor at-risk patients or patients that are even have mild illness and are progressing to more severe illness? And again, these could be remote monitors or telemedicine approaches too. And the last was triaging for care. So we've seen evidence of hospitals becoming overwhelmed during these surges and incidents. So is there an ability to rapidly assess these patients to determine if they're going to be at risk for severe outcome and need to be admitted to the hospital, or if they can be discharged and go home? And so many of these are more in vitro type technologies or platform diagnostics that can be deployed in urgent care emergency departments to help with that. But I will just say that this approach that we're applying for rapidly deployable capabilities really can be almost like a roadmap to how we think about emerging infectious diseases in general, of being able to step away from the pathogen and start thinking about the host response as we prepare to monitor these patients and help assess them for care. I'll transition to the next person. Thanks.
Thank you. Shayla, please.
Thank you. So thanks again to Sandeep for introducing the ENACT program. It's the term ENACT stands for Early Notification to Act, Control, and Treat. And this title really reflects what we're about. Despite the first impression that we might be solely focused on pre-symptomatic diagnostic of infections such as influenza or COVID, we really are more concerned about providing medical countermeasures, specifically in the diagnostic realm, as soon as possible. Right, Kumiko said earlier, acting fast is really key, no matter what. In any medical setting, the sooner you can detect the injury or the illness, the sooner you can determine what you're really working with, the sooner you can organize your resources, the sooner you can respond and treat the patient effectively and efficiently, right? So again, we're really all about providing early notification, early diagnostics, early solutions in order to improve health outcomes. And so we're looking at this goal, at this vision through 3 slightly different lenses. The first lens is really all about providing technologies that any individual can use. And that's, again, where the prime example of using physiological sensors to track your own health and to detect a potential infection comes into play. So we're really all about usable, user-friendly technologies such as wearable sensors. You know, your Fitbits, your Garmins, your Apple Watches, and new devices that whose technology development we support. That's a key part of that particular perspective or that lens, but it is also coupled with, of course, data analytics, right? Getting tons of physiological data second by second, minute by minute doesn't really mean much unless you can make sense of it for a particular question. So we're also interested in analytical solutions, developing new algorithms, developing potentially neural networks that help us understand that data in a particular context. The second lens of this early notification system is what kind of is really concerned with what medical care providers need to know. And so this is actually a very different box. We're not necessarily looking here at wearable sensors. We're looking here at point-of-care devices that, for example, can tell a doctor whether your infection is a viral or bacterial or some other origin. You know, what I would personally love to see, and we don't have this in our portfolio, but what I'd love to see is the ability to conduct an entire blood panel while you're sitting in the doctor's office within 5 minutes, right? That's an example of how providing early notification of health could really be relevant and could help improve medical outcomes. You know, another very different example that's much more tied to AI and data collection and data manipulation really is, for example, using numbers of injuries of injured patients or individuals with a particular disease to help organizations act sooner. So in my example that I always talk about, the example is that of a mass casualty event, which, you know, nobody really wants to happen. But should it happen again, I would love to see a solution that that brings together all kinds of first responders, as well as emergency rooms, as well as ICUs, as well as hospitals, and help direct injured and ill patients to the appropriate medical care site, right? Rather than, you know, having isolated responses by different groups of medical care providers. I'd love to see a more streamlined approach to saying, well, the person, let's say with a gunshot wound, should be sent to this particular site for medical care, while a person who maybe has a concussion, for whatever reason in this event, should, you know, would be better sent to another site because they are better suited to provide that type of medical care. So I really want to encourage you to think here outside of that paradigm of, you know, just sensors, but really about collecting data and then analyzing it and sharing it in a way that enables earlier medical care in a more efficient way. The third lens through which I look at ENACT is what kind of information would organizations like pharmacies or hospitals benefit from? And in that particular case, I personally tend to think that early knowledge of rising cases, for example, in a pandemic, can be very useful to hospitals or pharmacies to make staffing adjustments, to provide certain resources, PPE, certain medications, etc. And the sooner you get the information about new cases of certain illnesses, the sooner you can respond, right? So if we have the ability to provide information about new COVID cases right now, not the COVID cases from yesterday, but maybe from 5 minutes ago, I would like to believe that that information is really valuable to hospitals to help them understand, is this a hotspot developing? Should we hire more nursing staff? Should we procure more PPE? And so on and so on. And so I'd like to encourage all of you to think about this early notification paradigm, you know, through these three lenses. What would be useful for an individual for their own decision making so they can take agency of their health? What would be useful for the medical care provider so they can provide the best care and most effective and efficient care to an individual? And then, you know, what's really useful for large scale organizations so they can respond on a much broader level, I would say perhaps population wide. And so all of this is, again, you know, supported through all kinds of sensing technologies, because we are interested in diagnostics, and of course, AI technologies, data analytics, algorithm development.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is great. So I guess just turn it over to both Kim and Shayla. I mean, part of the hot topic of the hour is, you know, the pandemic that we have, and even before, during the talks, there was a question around how ENACT or how the portfolio over the last 2 years in your respective programs have played a role in responding to the pandemic. So if you Kim, you can lead it off if you can talk about, RDC and what that means since teaser. So I'll just turn it over to Kim. Thank you. And then Shayla can follow up. Thank you.
Sure. So when I mentioned our sepsis program, we've been thinking about sepsis for a while in terms of not just a static point in terms of infection and severity, but more in terms of a continuum. So there are a number of ways you can intervene with a patient once they're sick, from this pre-infection space to prevent that infection in the first phase through once they're infected, understanding the progression of that disease and how you can intervene along that pathway. So with sepsis, we put forward that continuum that showed that pre-infection space, sepsis, that's some discernible phenotype, progression to organ dysfunction, shock, and then also that recovery piece, which is really critical. And we notated on that continuum that we had these red nodes showing that each red node was an opportunity to intervene. And that's how we think about our strategy. So when COVID hit, we realized that we could really map this same approach in thinking about patient care. So thinking about the patient everywhere at all times along a continuum, from that asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic state through progression through these severe outcomes. And it became apparent that our traditional approaches that we target are mainly for the pathogen, which are definitely critical and play a very important role in the response. But we wanted to give some sort of adjunctive or more near-term ability to respond. And we thought of that in terms of looking at the host response in the patient. So we took these programs that we had within DRIVe, which really, in essence, are bookending the patient continuum, so at that early stage pre-infection, and then also at that end stage with that severe outcome of sepsis. And I should just clarify that, and it was stated before, but I can't say it enough, that almost any infection can lead to sepsis. And so if we're not being prepared for these severest outcomes of any disease like sepsis, then we're not prepared enough for these threats. And so if we could start to think about approaches to address sepsis, so viral sepsis is an outcome of COVID-19, as well as this early pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic part of the timeline that through Shayla's program, and then also everything in between, how to think about the host response in terms of monitoring those patients that have mild illness that may progress to more severe illness. So we use that continuum and looked at all the approaches that could be leveraged today, and wanted to pilot them or clinically validate them in these COVID-19 settings. And so we focused on, as I mentioned before, technologies that could empower that patient, so help them know if they're infected, help them know whether they could need to quarantine, empower the healthcare provider. I mean, that's critical when we have reduced resources. If you want to reduce face-to-face interaction between the patient and healthcare providers, and then triaging these patients for care, aiding in those clinical judgment and ethical decisions that need to be made when resources are limited and hospitals are overwhelmed, helping to understand how can we predict the outcomes that may occur with some of these patients. So we expanded our thinking of sepsis for COVID-19 in terms of just not thinking about disease progression that may lead to sepsis, but all aspects of infection severity that can occur along that continuum. And that's really where the program focused. And so our topic now actually in the EZ-BAA is infection severity and solving sepsis to encompass all those aspects, not necessarily stages, but progression of infection that can occur, such that we can think about a patient along that continuum and think about means to intervene or improve upon patient management if we can identify how sick they are or they will become. And again, this is potentially a way to map our response to any future threat that we may encounter. Shayla, do you want to add something in terms of your program and empowering the patient and healthcare provider?
Sure. So I would posit that the beauty of the ENACT program is that it's ultimately agnostic with respect to disease, right? So again, we're supporting technologies that provide early notification of health changes. BARDA, at BARDA, we like to think about it primarily in terms of issues that can give rise to a national health security event. such as epidemics and pandemics. So originally, the program that was actually originally led by Justin Yang focused on influenza as a use case. But again, it was a use case, right? The same technologies that you would use to detect infection in a person early could potentially be used to detect, the Zika virus or influenza or now COVID-19. Yes, obviously the parameters that you might be interested in or the final algorithm that you're developing, they might change. But the core of the technology ideally is independent of disease, or at least applies to a whole class of pathogens. And so for us, it's I think we were in a really great position to say, okay, we have a set of technologies. We can very easily pivot from influenza as a use case to SARS-CoV-2 as a use case. And specific examples are primarily wearable sensors, wearable physiological sensors, both off-the-shelf sensors as well as sensors that we've previously supported at BARDA DRIVe, that we've given to individuals at high risk of contracting COVID. And we're using their physiological data to understand, first of all, what kind of physiological changes can be recorded as a person goes from the healthy to the infected state and then develops the illness. And then also how soon those signs, physiological signs of illness really occur. Do they occur well before a person develops symptoms and physically feels sick? What can we say about that course of development of the disease? And so that's where we are right now. We've been able to utilize several of our previously supported technologies, pivot them to the COVID-19 case, and are now actively collecting data from in clinical studies and developing data analytics approaches to attempt to pre-symptomatically detect COVID infection. Of course, I think the reason for why that's of interest goes without saying, right? First of all, with a disease that has a relatively long incubation time of up to 5 days or so, and a disease that has so many asymptomatic individuals or sufferers, it really is key to detect signs of the infection as soon as possible, both in terms of ensuring a better health outcome for the infected person, but also, probably equally importantly, to help prevent additional infections. Another way in which ENACT has been able to contribute to Dr. Shredder's RDC effort has been through support of telemedicine services. We do have one project that has been utilizing telemedicine services across the entire nation to pinpoint and track new supposed COVID-19 diagnoses in order to help us better understand and do so in real time, in order to help us better understand how the disease spreads. Where does it spread? We hope to, in the future, be able to link that kind of real-time knowledge of a pandemic spread or even an epidemic spread to people's life circumstances, such as social determinants of health. We might be able in the future to link them to potentially their vaccination status, and so on and so on. So again, the fact that ENACT supports technologies that, yes, they have a specific use case, but they're in essence disease agnostic, helped us a lot in pivoting very quickly and very effectively to address the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the take-home message is that when the declaration of public health emergency was declared, we really pivoted quickly to try to address some gaps that were evident in the United States response continuum. So it's very, I think, goes back to the theme that the support of the U.S. government to technologies that may not have fit for COVID was able to be quickly pivoted, or the foundation that was built. So just as a follow-up to I guess I'll go into this, so we have some time here. So I'll ask Kim, where do you see your Solving Sepsis program going? I mean, you're in year 3 now. You guys have done quite a bit in terms of engaging the community. and re-energizing this field. Where do you see you guys going in 2021, and for the people who are listening?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I mean, it is more important than ever to really recognize the awareness around, or bring awareness, I guess, to sepsis and infection severity. And with COVID-19, we've been trying to push that messaging even more. Having an ability to really take that patient, understand how sick they're going to be, are they going to have the severe outcomes, is a gap where we are right now with some of our diagnostics. And if we could do that, we would be in a different place, or we potentially could be in a different place right now in how we're managing patients for care. And so it's my hope that the sepsis program will continue to support technologies in that infection severity space so that we can better help physicians and healthcare workers make decisions on patients for care. And when we launched this program, it wasn't that we were going to solve sepsis. We are working towards solving sepsis. And it's not our program alone that's going to do this. It really takes a whole community. It's the patients, it's the clinicians, it's the payers, it's the government. We're all working together to address the burden of sepsis and save patient lives. And we launched a hashtag, I think it was 2 years ago, hashtag Solving Sepsis Together, to really promote that messaging, that we aren't working in isolation in a silo. We're working across government. We've engaged with multiple government partners across different departments to align on our thoughts on what we're investing in, on messaging, and on how do we make sure that these technologies, that once they become available, that they can actually get to the patients and be utilized. So that awareness, that education piece continues to be forefront. We funded several groups within our portfolio that are building out educational content. And so we want to continue to launch that content and continue to bring awareness to this issue of sepsis in our country. And we're doing more messaging too ourselves within BARDA. We had a Sepsis Awareness Month website launched this past September on medicalcountermeasures.gov. So you'll probably see some more messaging and educational content this coming September for Sepsis Awareness Month. As I mentioned, this early recognition of sepsis is really key, and that's what's challenging with management of diseases right now. But sepsis can be caused by any infection. And so what is difficult in learning how to address it is it's not just trying to understand the progression of the infection or where you are on that continuum. It's the heterogeneity of the patient or the variability in the genetic makeup of the patient or their comorbidities. It's the fact that sepsis can arise from a number of different pathogens. And then also that it depends on the clinical setting where this first occurs. Is it in a pre-hospital setting? Is it in the hospital, or is it in a post-hospital setting? So all this needs to be taken into consideration when we think about interventions to address the patients. And so that's why we want to move or expand, I guess, our diagnostic portfolio to think about utility in these different clinical settings, as well as in different populations, so both with the pediatrics and adults as well. And then we want to move this ability to not just identify the patients that are at risk of severe outcomes, but tie this into an improved patient management approach. So being able to prognosticate not just the risk of severe outcome, but also can you stratify that patient and now tie it to a clinical management approach or know if they'll respond to a specific type of treatment. So there's interest in investing not just in these novel clinical management approaches or novel host-based therapeutics, but also tying that back into these endotyping or stratifying type tools. But ultimately, it's really important to intervene with these patients early and to understand how sick they may be. And so we need a better understanding of the host response. And a lot of this is going to be based on collating large data sets that represent the diversity that you see in presentation of sepsis. Because if we have these larger data sets, we can continue to learn about the host response, and this can then sort of feed back and inform some of the diagnostic and therapeutic interventions that are being developed.
Great. I mean, I think just to put into context the when we initially thought, when we were looking at, when people here who may not be in the field look at, delivering doses of bulk, product, right, and filling these vials, and the amount of transportation that needs to occur in the back end, and we saw it with the UPS trucks. I mean, these things are huge, right? And what Carrie, I think what you're trying to do is really move that, both from the waste side of disposable needles and the hazards associated with that, to kind of like, can we just develop these, very, very fine paper, like, dissolvable patches that can be applied. Both, you don't need, where you wouldn't need a potentially a healthcare provider to do that, but
Right.
maybe you yourself can just apply it on your at like a tattoo, hold it there for 20 seconds, and then give yourself a vaccination, right? That's kind of, I think it's really cool. I think it's needed. But I think the audience will need to, for context, like, I don't think, this pandemic, like these vaccines that we're developing now will be in time for this pandemic, but it's more for the future pandemics that you're thinking about.
Correct. And there's a lot of countries that don't have the capabilities we have here with cold storage, et cetera. So,
Right.
we, in thinking about them and just
Right.
rural populations, et cetera. So.
Right. All right. And then, Kumiko, and then I'll get to Shayla, but Kumiko, one of the major critics here, I mean, is, that I make a joke, but is that, repurposing isn't novel. I mean, why are we doing this? It's not innovative. Hey, we've been doing it for years. We've been doing it for 20 years. I mean, why redirect? Why are we doing this now? What challenges should we be thinking about that, like repurposing a drug is something that's innovation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, I think the important thing to keep in mind when considering the criticism of drug repurposing as not being innovative or not being novel is to keep in mind what our big picture problem is. Our problem is that we need to strengthen our preparedness posture in the event of a chemical emergency, because like I've said before and Sandeep said before, during these emergencies, and Shayla said before, we only have a few minutes to respond. We need to be able to respond in a moment's notice, and it's just in our advantage to find ways to repurpose therapeutics that are just commonly available, that you can pop into your local grocery store or a pharmacy or something to that effect, and then grab it and then administer it to individuals that have been exposed during an emergency. So the criticism of it not being novel or impactful, that's, in some cases that might be true, but we're not we're not interested in taking the most novel approaches simply because they're novel. If we can find an approach that is novel and unique and then solves our actual issues, then that's great. But fundamentally, we're in the business of being able to respond more effectively, better, and so we can save American lives or anybody's life during a chemical emergency. So I think that's the most, fundamental thing to keep in mind. Our goal is to save lives. It's not to take the most novel approach that there possibly is to address an issue. And then the second thing about, the sort of challenges that we're facing and the things that we need to keep in mind here is that, the drug repurposing effort sort of gets around some of the other difficulties and challenges that there are with conventional drug discovery. Primarily things like the amount of capital needed to sort of invest in R&D efforts for new compounds. We know most drugs fail before they reach phase 1 clinical trials, and even fewer even make it on to phase 2 or 3 or get FDA approved. So the repurposing effort really focuses on taking drugs that have a known safety and toxicological profile. So we know they're safe. We know that they're useful for some indication, but maybe they haven't found it yet. And then repurposing them as medical countermeasures. So again, in this case, we're looking for compounds that already have some other primary indications, so some reason that they might be already available in the community. So for example, it could be something, a therapeutic that treats something like asthma, or treats something like pulmonary arterial hypertension, or something to that effect. So it already has that primary indication, and then repurposing it as a medical countermeasure against a chemical threat. So something like chlorine, which has a similar overlap in the symptomology. and the phenotypes that we observe with exposures. So we really think that by repurposing, we can sort of circumvent that the time and money needed to invest in developing new drugs that are primarily just explicitly indicated for a chemical agent. And then we also think that it's just a good way. It's the best approach that we have at this time to be able to respond as quickly as possible. So by doing this, we can allow ourselves to have much broader access to these countermeasures without needing to stockpile. Because again, if we stockpile, we can't respond on a dime or in an instant if we have a chemical attack.
Great. All right. And then finally, Shayla. So I think, you know, as you mentioned, Shayla is now taking this program, you know, to a direction that's never been seen before for ENACT. I think, you know, with her leadership is really, I mean, I'll just tell the story, Shayla, of, you know, when we went out before and when we were standing up ENACT and, you know, was that we engaged the physician community. We engaged the end user community, and we talked about, hey, what if we had a wearable? What if we had a sensor? What if we had a technology that could predict or without seeing the need of a doctor? And I would just say, like, 60% of the room probably just laughed at us, right, 2 years ago, and they were like, this is never going to happen in the United States. We're never going to have mass adoption of telemedicine. We're never going to have this, and this. And I you know, and no one was interested. I mean, I'm telling you, it was like we were almost like begging to see if this was something that was a reality. And now, you know, under Shayla's leadership, I mean, we're really starting to see impact. So Shayla, I mean, my question to you, and this is probably the last question before we get to Troy, is that, you know, we see a demand for this. I mean, we see what the power of these tools and technologies can do, and where are we heading in the future?
So I think there are a couple of things that we need to mention to establish, to make sure that we're talking about the same kind of scientific or adoption premise, if you will. First one is just general acceptance of new technologies, right? Doesn't matter how great your technology is, how well it works. People need to have trust. People need to want to modify the behavior to adopt something. Second of all, the technologies that we develop need to be accessible, and that can mean different things for different people. I'm just going to list some of them. The technology needs to be equally or comparatively safe and accurate and precise for people with different bodily characteristics, whatever that might mean. It might also mean that the technologies might actually have to be affordable, right? Not everybody has, you know, a lot of disposable income to buy multiple wearables. So how can we help translate these technologies into a format that is actually accessible, right? That is sufficiently affordable and cheap and also easy to use. It doesn't require a whole host of external technologies, such as cell phones and whatnot, to function. So if we look at those three things, I think those three things are issues that we absolutely need to address if ENACT and similar programs are going to be successful. So, and that's what we're trying to do, right? So we very much believe in the utility of wearables. We very much believe in the utility of remote health monitoring, et cetera. We very much believe in the utility and effectiveness of telemedicine. However, our goal in the future is, or our vision is to help push innovation that provides for, again, acceptance, just general trust, which means a lot of things, including data security. It means that we push for innovation in affordability. So can our potential new future partners develop a wearable that costs $2 to produce as opposed to, you know, $100? So things like that are the areas where we're really pushing for innovation in terms of just wearables and helping people take agency of their own health. In terms of other ENACT developments, I think, you know, sky is really the limit. I don't necessarily know every single area in which early health notification could potentially be useful. And so, just like you, Justin, reached out to the medical community at first, we also want to continue the dialogue because, of course, the technological and the medical situation changes. The responses that we are going to get in a month are probably very different from the responses we would have gotten from the medical community a year ago. So I think engaging the medical community as well as whoever is the end user is incredibly important, right? Because we need to develop technologies that are ultimately going to be used and not just something that may function wonderfully in the lab, but nobody's interested in ultimately adding to their life. And so I think we have a lot of room to grow in different directions, but we're primarily driven by the factors of usability and accessibility, and we're really interested in end users' feedback on what works for them and what they'd like to see.
Thanks. All right. So we have 10 minutes here. I'm going to ask Troy, who's our contracting officer, lead extraordinaire here.
So I know we've alluded to it during the course of our presentation discussion here, but our bread and butter procurement mechanism within DRIVe is the EZ-BAA, or the Easy Broad Agency Announcement, and that supports each of these areas of interest that we spoke on: the sepsis, the ENACT, the redirect, and the beyond the needle. The beauty of the EZ-BAA is that it's significantly streamlined from BARDA's broad BAA. So we can make awards in a faster timeline, sometimes within 30 days from when we receive proposals. The caveats to the EZ-BAA are that we are capped at $750,000 awards. So they're a lot smaller in nature, a little less complex. However, we can make them swiftly and quickly. And our intention here is to essentially throw 100 darts at a board, and we already assume that 90 to 95 of them aren't going to pan out. That's the goal: fast or fail quick, if we're going to fail at all. Also, the process with the EZ-BAA, we want to be a little more collaborative, with our potential partners. So I see a lot of comments and chats asking, is this particular technology or product we have suitable for one of your programs, or what programs do you have opening up, or is this might work for this? I highly recommend anyone who is interested in one of our programs or areas of interest to set up a discussion with one of our program managers. That way you can determine on your own if your project or technology seems suitable for one of our areas of interest and fits the goals and missions within DRIVE. That'd be step one. I highly encourage to get that out of the way first. That way you don't waste time down the line submitting an abstract and going, getting deeply involved in the process. So after that discussion is met with one of our program managers, then if you feel as though your project or technology is suitable for DRIVE, you can go ahead and submit an abstract. And we have that via our DRIVE Digital Resources platform. It's all online. Set up an account. It's quick, it's easy. And when you submit it, we'll go through some initial compliance checks, and we'll determine if this technology or product is something that is suitable for our portfolio within one of the AOIs. From there, if we want to move forward, we refer to that as stage 2. Stage 2 would be an actual official request for proposal or more detailed information regarding statement of work, more detailed technical information, cost information, etc. And then once you get to stage 2, then we have the possibility of entering into negotiations and ultimately getting to an award. So again, the key component here is to really do the upfront conversation with each of the program managers to determine if your product technology might be suitable for our portfolio, and make the determination from there if you want to take the time to go ahead and proceed with the EZ-BAA. Some other fun facts about the EZ-BAA is that a large portion, I think it's over 80% of our awards, have gone to small businesses. I think it's at least 50% of our awards have gone to companies that have not had any government contracts or funding before. So we definitely get our reach out there, and we definitely form contracts with companies that definitely deserve them and don't have any prior ties with the government.